everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. You've heard it time and time again. Trust your gut. Something I completely agree with, especially when dealing with new situations, people, places. It's helpful to be able to follow that instinct. But isn't it possible to be deceived? I think so. Can you be so excited to be somewhere, or so completely enthralled with someone that you miss the signs along the way? Mistake that gut feeling for butterflies or simply the anticipation for what you're on your way to experience. It's entirely possible to be caught up in the moment and in turn, caught off guard. We have to trust our instincts the best we can, but sometimes, even as humans, we fall victim to certain traps, ones laid out by those who want to harm us, one way or another. But hopefully, by some quick way of thinking, or sometimes just dumb luck, we survive. So, let's get started, shall we? For years, I had what I guess you'd call bad luck in the love department. I'm happily married now, but let's just say I kissed a lot of toads to get here. When people talk about their dating nightmares, I'm always reminded of my own. And no offense to the gal who got ghosted, or the guy whose date had bad breath. But I think my experience actually falls into the nightmare category. This was back in 2000, and it was before online dating became the new and improved way to meet someone. I think maybe eHarmony was around, but I was 20 years old and that website seemed like it was for people my parents' age. So I was dating the old-fashioned way, meeting guys at bars or friend of a friend, and none up to this point were successful. Then I met Harrison, a 25-year-old swim instructor from Tallahassee. I thought my luck had changed. He walked into the restaurant I'd worked at for 3 years, and I was his waitress. Charming fellow, Harrison was. He was kind and flirtatious throughout his entire visit. And it was that first visit that I learned almost everything I knew about him. I learned that he was a swim instructor, he loved dogs, and that he'd had his heart broken recently. Now, maybe some of you would call this type of sharing a red flag. Who tells a stranger that they just met about their heartbreak? However, I wasn't fazed. None of this came off as creepy, and honestly, I was flirting with him, asking him all sorts of questions, and he was doing the same. Eventually, my shift was over, and I noticed that Harrison was in the bar. I wasn't 21 at the time, but as a waitress, I was allowed to walk back there for work. Luckily, the bartender working was a friend, and she knew what I was trying to do and let me chat with my new friend. He smiled at me instantly and said, "I've been waiting for you, actually. Figured I could buy you a drink." I had to disclose to Harrison I wasn't quite of age yet, and he suggested going back to his place. And now I know what you're thinking, and I was thinking it too. And honestly, I wasn't exactly ready to run off with this guy yet, so I made a silly excuse about having to babysit that night, but wanted to give him my number. Numbers were exchanged. It was wonderful. Hearts, butterflies, the whole deal. Fast forward about a week later. I never heard from the guy. Texting was sort of new at the time, so I wasn't sure I'd hear from him in that way, but I did kind of expect a call. Well, who walks into my restaurant that week? Harrison, of course. I'm hanging in the back as I see him walk in, and it basically looks like he's asking for me. The hostess confirms this by coming to find me, so I act busy in the back. After a couple of minutes, I greet him at the front, and I ask if he needs a table. I wasn't going to act any sort of way. I guess I felt a little jaded. But he dives right in. He's sorry he hasn't called, so busy getting his new gig set up at the local swimming pool. He's sort of panicked, he's nervous, blah, blah. Well, he was ticking all the boxes I needed to agree to go on a date with him that night when I was off work. He comes back a couple of hours later to pick me up. I leave the guy's number and name with my friend at the restaurant. I joke that if I don't show up tomorrow, then this is the guy that murdered me. We share a laugh, and I go meet my date outside. Of course he drives a cool car, I remember thinking to myself. He hops out and opens my door, still checking all those boxes. I ask him where we're headed, and he says, "We're going dancing." He playfully asks if I've got my dancing shoes on. We make small talk, listen to music. I remember that's how I learned he could sing. Eventually, we pull into the parking lot of an old barn converted into an all-ages dance club. I'm so excited I almost hop out of the car before he even parks it. But before I do, he tells me, "Hang on a minute," while grabbing my arm. Not too hard, but it was meant to stop me from leaving the car. I wait, somewhat patiently, but I end up asking what we're waiting for. He doesn't answer me. He's looking around the parking lot instead, so I follow his eyes, but yeah, I've got no idea what he's looking for. Then he says, "Okay, we gotta go." And without any more words, he quickly shifts the car into reverse, and we're on our way out. For a moment, I'm just silent, waiting for him to explain himself. He didn't. Instead, he nervously looked from the road to his rear view, over and over, until finally I decided to look too. There was a car following us, pretty close at this point, and so I asked him, "Do you know them?" He shakes his head, indicating no, and then he makes an incredibly sharp right turn onto a different road. After I adjust from the turn, I ask him, "What the hell?" He nonchalantly apologizes and then lets out a "shit" while looking in the rear view. At this point, I'm officially not liking the situation and really hating the short to no answers I'm getting, and I abruptly ask him to just take me back to the restaurant. It's closer than my house, and I was no longer sure I wanted Harrison knowing where I lived. But he ignores me and starts picking up speed. I brace myself by grabbing the door frame, and out of curiosity and fear, I decide to look behind us again. There's still a car following us, and it too is picking up speed. We hit a fork in the road, and a left would take us to the restaurant, and a right would take us to the next town over. I was so relieved when we took a left, but it was short-lived when I realized whoever was following us was still following us. Not only that, their car was extremely close, and moments after the turn, they almost hit our car. Then suddenly, they're trying to pass us on the wrong side of the road. Harrison puts out another "shit," but quickly follows it up with a "crazy bitch." And that's when it sort of clicked with me. He had to know who this person was, because there's no way he could see the driver if I couldn't. Who's a crazy bitch? Who's following us, Harrison? I'm no longer patient or kind. When we're getting close enough to the restaurant, I'm hoping he just drops me off and I never see him again. I should be so lucky. Instead, he starts blocking the car from passing him by also traveling into the oncoming lane, and that's when I just start yelling to let me out, let me out. For a while, he doesn't listen, but suddenly, he starts to slow slightly and whips into a gas station just before the restaurant. I think to get out of the car, but he beats me to it, telling me, "Stay here," and closes the door. Immediately, and somewhat crouched down, I turn to see what's about to unfold through the back window. I see a woman exit the driver's side and immediately charges towards Harrison. He braces for her with his arms out in front. Once they connect, she's screaming all sorts of things at him. Liar, cheater, piece of shit. I mean, you name it, she's saying it. For a moment, I think I should just make a run towards the restaurant. It's only a few blocks, I reason with myself. Then the woman starts swatting at his chest, still calling him names, and yet he maintains distance by holding his arms out. I can hear her yelling turn to sobbing, and she turns her attention to Harrison's car. Oh God, please don't come near me, is all I can think. I'm all of 5 foot, 120 pounds, soaking wet, and I've never been in a fight in my life. Needless to say, I was not prepared for any of this. Especially what actually happens next. The woman is kicking and screaming now, her kicks directed at Harrison's car. The bumper, the doors, his taillights. She's going for all of it. Granted, she's only using her hands, but her aggression seems to be making some damage. Truthfully, I wasn't even thinking about myself anymore. I did lock the doors, but now I was just watching this shit show explode in front of me. I decided this was a decent time to call my friend from the restaurant. She's still working, but her shift ends shortly. I dial the number and start explaining to my friend the moment she answers the phone. She tells me to get the F out of there. I'm literally in the middle of it. But then it gets worse. I watch as Harrison grabs the woman by her hair, yanking her away from the car, aggressively. Seconds later, I see Harrison whip her around, wrap his hands around her throat. He's fucking choking her. Oh, fuck no, I think to myself. I tell my friend what's happening and she tells me now's my chance to run away. She's right. I keep her on the line as I unlock the door and scream at Harrison, trying to get his attention so he stops choking the woman. But he's blinded with rage, not even paying attention to me. In a last-ditch effort to get him off, I scoop up a handful of gravel and throw it in his face. I do this 2 more times until he finally stops. The woman drops to the ground. She's not dead. That's all I needed to know before making a run for it. I could hear Harrison yelling after me. He sounded angry. I'm scared, don't get me wrong, but I don't go to the restaurant. Instead, I head straight into the gas station. I tell the attendant to call the police, that a man is strangling a woman in his parking lot right now. I look outside with the man, and the scuffle continues, with the woman kicking up at Harrison as he tries to grab her up off the ground. I hear the attendant describe the man in his car to the dispatcher. And I don't know why, but I'm asking the attendant if there's anything that he can do, pleading with him that this girl needs help. Then I hear my friend in my ear. I forgot I'd had my phone to my ear because she'd been so quiet, but she tells me, I'm coming, and hangs up. Within moments of the call ending, I see Harrison is no longer outside of his car. He's now in his car and officially driving away. The woman is just sitting on the gravel in front of her own car. I suspect she's crying. I considered going out there to talk to her, but before I could muster the courage, she's getting up and fixing her way back into her car. So what happens if they both leave? Like, what are the cops going to do now? I asked the attendant, assuming he had more experience in this department than myself, but he shakes his head and says, I have no idea. Did you get a license plate for them? Fuck. All that time, and I never wrote down or texted the license plate. My friend beats the cops to the gas station, and with her, she's holding a piece of paper. It's got the name and the number I wrote down earlier. But, like the beautiful genius that she is, my friend also jotted down Harrison's license plate when we were leaving the restaurant that night. I hug her, thanking her. She waits with me as I give my statement to the police, and eventually drives me home. Normally, I'd take a bus, but my friend wasn't allowing it, and I was grateful. All I wanted was to get home as quick as possible, take a shower, and forget this whole mess. The whole ride home, we just talked about what a bullet I dodged. I was totally enamored by this guy, and if it wasn't for this incident, it might have taken me a lot longer to figure out who he really was. I called my cell phone carrier the next day and had Harrison's number blocked. I consider myself lucky that this is the only time I've ever seen a man lay his hands on a woman. So in the end, Mr. Perfect was anything but perfect. He was indeed the opposite. A true asshole. Scum. And I also consider myself lucky that that was truly the last time I ever had to see Harrison. Hopefully, he's locked away somewhere, far away from women. Like I said, I'm married, so no, not all men are creeps, bad guys, scum, abusers. But they do exist. So, it's okay to have your guard up a little when you're getting to know someone. Taking that extra time could save you a whole lot of hurt. After retiring last year, I moved to the cabin my late husband and I spent our summers in. It's surrounded by miles of forest on every side, and we stayed here for 2 months out of the year from 1988 to 2020, when COVID got Johnny. That year I hired a maintenance man to help with the upkeep, but I came back with my sister the following year. I hadn't actually been there alone until the move, but I didn't think it would be a problem. Nothing unusual or worse than a flat tire had ever happened in all those years, but this was my first winter in the cabin. When the snow came, something else came with it. There's no trash service way out here, so when my bins are full, I take them to the dump, but until then, they sit beneath my small carport. Of course, I have to buy the heavy-duty bins with locks so wildlife doesn't tear into them, but that had never been a big deal before. Then one morning, I woke to piles of trash scattered all over my yard, with a trail leading into the forest. I thought I must have just forgotten to lock one of the bins, but when I checked, both locks were still securely engaged. Something managed to rip open the sides and pull the trash out that way. I can't even imagine a beast strong enough to do such a thing, but judging by the evidence, it was something with extremely sharp claws. I called my son and he came out later that afternoon with new, extremely heavy-duty bins. These made the old ones look like cheap stuff, and John Jr. promised the biggest bear in the world wouldn't be able to get into them. He even offered to spend the night just to make sure everything was all right, and it was. We ate steak dinners, threw the bag of leftovers in the bin, and they were still perfectly intact the following morning. It seemed like everything was back to normal, but 2 weeks later, the new bins were destroyed as well. It happened the same night as an awful storm. I listened to the wind and thunder all night, just praying that I still had a roof when morning came. The cabin was fine, of course, but the bins weren't. The one with the steak scraps had been ripped open just like before, and trash was scattered everywhere with a trail leading into the forest at the same spot. John Jr. didn't believe me when I called. I don't blame him for thinking that it had to be the storm, but wind doesn't create claw marks and peel the metal back like a tin can. You would need power tools or some kind of heavy-duty machinery to replicate the damage done to those things. Not knowing what else to do, we called the police. We knew they wouldn't be able to do anything per se. We mostly just wanted their opinion, so we said that someone had vandalized my property in the night. The officer on the phone thought that it was storm damage too, but we convinced them to send someone in the end. An hour later, 2 policemen arrived and took our statements along with some photos, but they were only placating me by that point. I think they felt sorry for me. They were very kind, and they agreed this wasn't storm damage, but they also didn't think that it was done by a human. That much we agreed on. Even if it was possible, what would be the point of driving all the way to such awful weather just to tear apart an old woman's trash can? I certainly don't have any enemies. They had no idea what kind of animal could pull off such a feat either, but they called someone from the Wildlife and Fisheries Department. The game warden came out a few hours later. He took one look at the damage and went pale as a ghost. He'd seen a few similar incidents over the years, always during the winter, at other homes in the area. There used to be a good number of cabins and hunting lodges around here, but now there's only a handful left. Most were torn down or abandoned. When I asked what the other homeowners did about the problem, he said they moved away or stopped coming during the winter months. An elderly man used to have a cabin just a few miles from mine. When something started tearing his trash apart, he simply stopped leaving it outside. Then one night, a terrible blizzard blew through, and his family was unable to reach him the following morning. His son-in-law came to check on him and found the front door ripped off of its hinges, blood everywhere. A trail of it was followed into the forest, but no other traces of the old man were ever found. I just don't understand how no one is doing anything about it. The whole area should be closed off until this creature is killed. People have died. I could have died. I spent the rest of last winter with my son and his family, but it was just too crowded to stay there long term, and I can't bear to part with the cabin. I know it sounds silly after everything I've said, but my husband and I had such wonderful times here. Nothing remotely unusual has happened since my return, but now it's almost winter again, and I don't think I should be here when the first snow falls. Hi there, long-time listener, first-time submitter, but I'm kind of scared of my little sister Rosie. I'm 17 and she's 6. I'm not really sure where to start. My mom's worked mostly nights since Dad died a few years ago, so I spend a lot of time babysitting. Rosie was pretty normal until this past year, when things started to change. The first strange thing to happen was when she started sleepwalking. I'm not even sure if it's related, but there have been a few incidents that really freaked me out. The worst was the first night it ever happened. I woke up to see her standing over me, and she wouldn't answer when I asked what she was doing. Thinking that she must have had an accident, I sat up and noticed that it was past 3. Seeing nothing obviously wrong, I asked why she came to me instead of Mom. That's when I really noticed her wide, unblinking gaze and slightly agape mouth. At first, I thought she was faking it, but then she didn't blink for almost 10 minutes straight. I woke Mom up after the first 3. Rosie's eyes were spilling over with tears, but her expression never changed. And that's a freaky thing to see a 6-year-old do in the middle of the night. It doesn't really stop there, though. If sleepwalking were the only problem, I wouldn't be here. We talked to a doctor, and it turns out sleepwalkers just do some weird stuff. We got used to handling it, and things were mostly fine for a couple of months. But then she started having night terrors a few times a week. In the beginning, they were just normal kid stuff, monsters and goblins, something beneath the bed grabbing her ankles. Mom and I spent a lot of time convincing her that they weren't real. We'd just started making progress when she had a dream about Grandpa dying. He was asleep in bed when a black shadow mass crept from under the door, up the wall, and across the ceiling before coming to a stop directly above him. The face of an old, angry man formed in the center of the mass as it slowly stretched itself down towards our grandfather and covered his entire body. Rosie said he suffocated beneath it, awake but unable to escape. She woke up screaming, and none of us were able to go back to sleep that night. She described it in such vivid detail, I feel like I saw it myself. We spent all morning trying to calm her down, but nothing worked. At 7:30, we tried to call Grandpa so she could hear that he was fine, but he didn't answer. We tried again 30 minutes later, but still got nothing. That wasn't normal. He always answered his phone. And on the rare occasion that he didn't, he never took longer than a few minutes to return the call. Mom eventually drove to his house and found him still in bed. The doctor said he suffered a stroke in his sleep. It was already such an awful situation, but having to tell Rosie was something else entirely. She reasoned that if the dream about Grandpa was real, they would all be real. Nothing will ever convince her that he died of a stroke, and now she thinks the black mass killed Dad and might come for us next. It sounds ridiculous during the day, but then, when I'm alone in my room at night, it suddenly starts feeling all too real. Mom says it's a 1,000,000 to 1 coincidence, but that's all it is, a coincidence. I want to believe her. I do. It's just so unnerving. Rosie starts seeing her therapist next week, so hopefully that helps. We really don't know what else to do. I try to put on a good face for her sake, but I'm just as terrified as she is. And I can tell that Mom is too, despite wearing her own brave face. Every time Rosie wakes up screaming, we hold our breath until we know what she saw. I just wish life would go back to normal. There used to be this old abandoned church behind our middle school. It's not there anymore because it burned down after I graduated high school, and they never rebuilt anything in its place. When we were kids, we'd go there after school and hang out, usually with zero issues. We weren't exactly allowed there, but no one ever shooed us away either. I was in 7th grade and my younger sister was in 5th grade. After school, just like so many other days, I walked to the church with a group of friends and waited for my sister to get out of elementary school, which was a half-hour behind. Usually for fun, we would act out scenes from our favorite movies. We'd stand up near the podium, which still stood tall at the head of the church, while the others would act as the audience in the pews. On this day, I was on stage with my best friend, and we were acting out some of our favorite scenes from Clueless. The party scene. First, when Dion finds Murray has shaved his head, and then it was time for the rollin' with the homies scene, where Ty hits her head on the lamp. We're about to start the second part when someone in our audience screams. Then, 2 screams. My friend and I are like, "What the fuck, guys?" Totally assuming something innocent. "That cross moved," they shouted over each other. We turn around to face the large cross that they were talking about, only it's perfectly still. Clearly, they were messing with us. So we keep going with our skit, but the audience is restless now. We try to ignore that fact and attempt to make them laugh. Suddenly, my friend lets out a small yelp, whips around while swatting near her head. Something whispered in her ear. "What did it say?" I asked. My friend says that she doesn't know. It was like someone was just breathing in her ear. Maybe it said hi, or maybe it was just a hiss. I know my friend well enough to determine that I don't think she's messing with me. The church feels cold all of a sudden. The audience is on their feet, and I realize that we are collectively thinking the same thing. So I say it. Let's go. We shuffle off the stage and make our way to the church entrance. Before we reach the door, we're temporarily stopped and startled by a loud crash coming from behind us. The large cross hanging, the one that the girls said moved, was now completely off the wall and crash landed directly where my friend and I stood just moments ago. None of us stuck around long enough to do any more investigating. That was enough for us to understand our idea to leave was the right one. I was so shocked, scared, or dazed by the entire experience, I almost forgot to pick up my sister. I just started walking straight home. Halfway there, I realized my mistake and went back for my sister. She usually likes to cut through the church, but this day, and basically every day moving forward, we avoided that place. When the place burnt down years later, it was said that some sort of satanic ritual was taking place. No one died in the fire, but people reported hearing screaming coming from the area, and within moments it was up in flames. Police deemed it arson, but no one was ever caught. Not that we know of, anyway. Now the church is an abandoned pile of burnt rubble with a weak police tape barrier. I believe kids still mess around in there, but honestly, I can't imagine why. I'm a 26-year-old male photographer. Last year, I spent almost 2 months on a series of nightlife shots in San Francisco. That means I had to spend a lot of time walking around a big city at night, but I wasn't trying to get mugged. I mostly stuck to loud nightclubs and bustling streets until the final day of the shoot. It had been a long project, so I wanted to celebrate taking the final shots by taking a few shots, if you know what I mean. Anyway, I had a few more than I should have, and I left the bar feeling a bit more than tipsy. The curb outside was overcrowded with obnoxious drunks waiting for their Ubers, and the noise was giving me a headache. So I walked a few blocks over before requesting my own ride. As I waited beneath a streetlight on a quiet corner, I was suddenly startled by the sound of someone whistling nearby. It was a low, eerie tune, like something you'd hear a serial killer whistling while he stalked his victim. At first, I tried to ignore it, but then it grew louder, and finally, I heard a quiet set of footsteps creeping closer behind me. I turned around expecting to see some deranged attacker looming over me. But there was only the outline of a lone figure silhouetted against a dark storefront. It was a man, but I couldn't make out much more than that until he stepped forward, out of the shadows. Then, I was able to see his pointed face, beady eyes, and yellow teeth behind a sinister, greedy sneer. He flicked away a cigarette and gave me the most inhumanely wide smile I'd ever seen. Then he began reciting some generic sob story that ended with a plea for money, which is the exact reason I don't carry cash. The man's smile was instantly replaced by an awful scowl when I said as much, and it was clear he intended to make trouble. He took another step closer, so I matched it with one in reverse. My heart sank as his hands shot into his coat pockets. When he brought them out again, the world began moving in slow motion as my eyes focused on the very large pocket knife he now held. And my only concern became putting as much distance as possible between myself and that blade. I turned to run at the same instant that he lunged, and I just felt the knife graze across my back. Luckily, he put a little too much weight behind his thrust and kept going straight to the ground. I heard his fall, but I didn't stop to look back. Instead, I kept running until I got to a crowded area. I had so much adrenaline pumping through me, I didn't even realize I was bleeding until I made it home and tried to change clothes. The back of my shirt had a blood-stained rip through it, and my back ended up needing a few stitches. As it turns out, that knife had done a little more than graze me, but I still considered myself pretty lucky. Obviously, the police never caught the guy. I didn't expect them to, but it seemed wrong not to at least report it. I don't know what the quote-unquote right thing to do is in that situation. My situation could have turned out better, but it also could have turned out worse. I don't know if I would handle it the same way again, and I hope I never find out. On the rare occasion I'm out alone at night, I'm much more careful these days. Well, thanks for letting me share. Be safe out there, guys. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. But thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world over here. So thank you so much for listening. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night, and keep those eyes open long enough to find those deep sleep videos, and of course, double features. Please subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and another thanks to all of you for listening. A huge shout out to all of my patrons, whom I appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, and Adrienne. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining my Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Keep sending them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.